Maps are lies. Honest lies, but lies all the same. Every surveyor knows this. You stand on a ridge with your transit and your chain and your leather journal, and you translate the world into angles and distances and elevation changes, and you draw lines on paper, and you call it knowing a place. But the land doesn't care about your lines. The land has its own borders, its own boundaries, its own cartography written in the grain of rock and the path of water and the memory of 10,000 years of feet walking the same trails. Some maps can be read, some can only be felt, and some require a man to choose which side of a drawn line he belongs on, when to stand still, when to step across, when to accept that the lines he's drawn in his journal don't matter against the lines written by time itself. This is the story of a man who learned that lesson on a mountain in Colorado Territory in the autumn of 1878. Cyrus Tanner was a land surveyor, a man whose entire life had been devoted to precision. At 42 years old, he was lean and angular, with a narrow, weathered face and deep-set brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore his short graying brown hair under a flat-crowned dark brown hat. A clean-shaven jaw with a thin scar along the right cheekbone. A souvenir from the war, though not from any spectacular moment, just from a stumble over barbed wire in Virginia in the spring of 1863. He dressed always in a heavy canvas coat, the color of dried sage over a dark wool vest and white cotton shirt, brown corduroy trousers, and scuffed leather boots that had walked through every territory west of the Mississippi. A surveyor's transit was slung over one shoulder, and a leather journal was tucked under his arm. The same journal in which he had recorded every mile of every survey since the day he left the Union Army's Cartography Division in 1865. His wife Eleanor had understood maps in a way that most people did not. She had never asked him to stop surveying, never urged him toward a more settled life. Standing in the cabin doorway with light turning her dark hair to bronze, she would ask him what he was measuring that day. She would fold the previous day's maps with the care of someone who understood they were not just paper, but the translation of devotion into something others could follow. She would make coffee in pre-dawn darkness and pour it into his metal cup, and he would drink it watching her hands move through the familiar domestic choreography. Only after she was gone did he understand that she had been asking him a different question. What distance he was trying to put between himself and something he could not name. What interior landscape he was trying to map with every ridge he surveyed, every mile he measured. The wound from Antietam announced itself every morning before his eyes opened. His left leg below the knee announced itself in his hip bone with the arrival of cold, a conversation between bone and weather that had no words. His left boot wore at a different angle than his right, the heel scuffed by the particular drag of his limp. It was not a terrible disability. He could walk 10 miles if he needed to, could climb steep terrain, could pursue his work with all the dedication any able-bodied man could muster. But the cold mornings knew. The land had wounded him, and the land would never let him forget it. His surveying instruments received from him a devotion that bordered on ritual. Each night, after the day's work was recorded and the measurements were entered into his journal, Cyrus would clean them. The transit, that brass and steel eye with which he translated the world's angles. The chain, links of steel that measured distance with mathematical certainty. The compass, which knew the earth's deeper truths. Each was oiled with the kind of care a priest might give to an altar. The lenses were polished with flannel cloth. Precision was the only prayer Cyrus still said. In cleaning his instruments, in the methodical care he gave to the tools of his trade, he was performing a kind of faith that measurement mattered, that accuracy could be achieved, that the world could be known if only one was patient enough and careful enough to ask the right questions. He had come west to map the land, not to fight anyone. He had already done enough fighting. At Antietam, a shell fragment had passed through his left leg below the knee, and though the surgeons saved the leg itself, they couldn't save him from the limp that would follow him for the rest of his life. The war had ended, and Cyrus had walked away from it with a satchel full of maps and a determination never to be part of that kind of violence again. So he became a surveyor for the territorial government, a man paid to draw lines, not cross them. He measured the land because measuring it kept him moving, and moving kept the grief at arm's length. His wife Eleanor had died of consumption 2 winters ago, and Cyrus had learned that standing still was the worst thing he could do. Movement was survival. The road was mercy. On the 3rd of October, 1878, Cyrus was surveying a new route through the mountain passes south of Silver Bluff, Colorado, when he found the man. It was mid-afternoon, that golden hour, when the light turns amber and the aspens seem to glow from within. The first frost had come early that year, and the valley floor was silvered each morning, though it burned away by noon. The sky above the distant peaks was the particular blue that exists only at high altitude, a blue so clear and absolute that it seemed to have weight. Cyrus was working on a ridge above a rock formation that had caught his attention the previous day. A massive upthrust of dark stone that rose like a broken tooth from the earth, useful as a survey point. He first noticed the blood, a dark stain on the stone leading around the formation's western face. The blood had dried in the thin mountain air. Flies that should not have been this high at this elevation had found it, settling in small, angry clouds. The land reacted to violence faster than Cyrus had ever wanted to understand. He followed the trail around the formation to a recessed area where the rock created a shallow shelter. The formation was sandstone, layered in bands of deep red and cream, the kind of geological history that told you everything if you knew how to read it. Those layers represented time on a scale that made human violence seem almost trivial. And yet the violence was there, written in blood mere hours old, temporary as water. The rock had stood through epochs. This wound was a moment. There, slumped against the stone with his left shoulder wrapped in strips of torn buckskin tied with sinew, was a young Chiricahua Apache warrior. Cyrus could see from across the clearing the way the warrior's body listed to avoid putting weight on the injured shoulder, the way his breathing was careful and shallow. He retrieved his supplies, clean cloth from an old shirt, whiskey from his flask, and a salve made from willow bark and sage that he'd bought from an old woman in Santa Fe. The smell of blood and alcohol mixed in the cold air, an olfactory signature of necessity. The man was perhaps 28 years old, with a strong angular jaw and shoulder-length black hair held back with a leather cord. His dark, sharp eyes opened when Cyrus approached, and one hand moved instinctively toward a bone-handled knife at his beaded belt. He was wearing fringed deerskin leggings and knee-high moccasins wrapped with sinew. A single eagle feather was tied in his hair. His name, though Cyrus would not learn it until later, was Neshoba. "Don't move," Cyrus said in English, knowing the man might not understand, but hoping the tone would translate. He set down his transit and his journal with the care of a man laying down something sacred. "I'm going to look at that shoulder." Neshoba's eyes tracked him like a wounded animal tracking a hand reaching toward it. The knife at his beaded belt was within reach, but his grip loosened slightly. The smallest gesture of acceptance in a situation where acceptance meant trusting a stranger who might deliver either salvation or betrayal. Cyrus had studied field medicine during the war, though that was perhaps too generous a word for learning to work with blood and inadequacy in equal measure. Every surveyor learned basic doctoring. The wilderness didn't care about credentials, and sometimes you were the only one who stood between a man and death. He carefully unwrapped the buckskin strips, trying to move slowly enough that the cloth didn't tear the fragile scab that had started to form. A bullet had passed through the shoulder from back to front, entering above the collarbone and exiting near the shoulder blade. The kind of wound that would fascinate a surveyor if it didn't horrify him. The wound was 3 days old, maybe 4. Infection had not set in yet, but it would. Without treatment, gangrene would take him within a week. Untreated, the man was dead. He cleaned the wound with whiskey. Neshoba made no sound, though his jaw tightened so visibly that Cyrus could see the muscles working beneath the skin, the only sign that the cleaning caused him pain. His eyes closed entirely, not in weakness, but in the kind of focused concentration that comes from enduring something you cannot stop. When Cyrus applied the salve and wrapped the shoulder in clean cloth with the methodical care of someone who had learned that precision mattered, even when you were working with improvised supplies, Neshoba opened his eyes. He looked at Cyrus with an expression of pure calculation, the look of a man measuring risk, deciding whether this stranger was threat or help, and finding the answer ambiguous. "You need to rest," Cyrus said. "The wound will kill you if you don't." Neshoba spoke for the first time. "Soldiers come. 3 days." His English was sparse but clear. "I was riding with my brother. They shot from hiding. My brother—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. "You're safe here," Cyrus said. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Cyrus said it anyway. That night, Cyrus set up a basic camp in the shelter of the rock formation. He built a small fire, just enough for warmth, and shared his food, hardtack and dried meat, with the warrior. Neshoba ate without speaking. By midnight, he was asleep, the fever beginning to work its way through his body despite the salve. Cyrus sat with his journal, writing down what he'd done, documenting the wound's appearance, the treatment applied. Even in crisis, even in the face of a choice that might cost him everything, Cyrus's instinct was to record, to measure, to create a permanent mark on paper. The soldiers came the next morning. There were 8 of them, riding in loose formation down the valley trail, their blue coats unmistakable against the golden aspens. The jingle of spurs and tack preceded the sight. Leading them was a man Cyrus recognized immediately, Captain Ward Jessup. They'd fought in the same war, though on opposite sides of various rivers. Jessup was a career army man, not evil, not even unkind, just a soldier who followed orders and expected the world to do the same. Behind him rode Otto Kraus, Cyrus's surveying partner of 3 years, sitting his horse with the posture of a man already calculating what could be saved from this moment. Jessup dismounted first. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with gray in his beard and the weathered look of someone who'd spent his entire life in the field. His eyes took in the scene immediately. The camp, the wounded man, Cyrus standing between them. There was no surprise in his expression, only a kind of professional assessment. "Cyrus," Jessup said. His voice was neutral, professional. Step aside. Can't do that, Cyrus replied. His own voice was steady. He's a hostile. He was riding with raiders who hit a cavalry outpost 3 days south. We tracked him here. He's a wounded man, Cyrus said. He's been here since yesterday. He's not going anywhere. Jessup studied him for a long moment. You know what's going to happen if you keep standing there? You'll lose your contract. Your surveying career in this territory is finished. And for what? For an Apache warrior you don't even know? For the principle, Cyrus said, that a man doesn't get decided on based on what tribe he was born into. This isn't about tribe, Jessup said. His voice had not changed tone. This is about law. This is about order. This man is a combatant in an ongoing conflict. That's not your decision to make. Otto shifted on his horse. His face had the look of a man calculating what he would lose if he stood with Cyrus. A decade of work together, and it was all being converted into liability in the space of a moment. I've got orders, Jessup continued. Those orders say to bring in any Apache found in this territory who's been involved in any action against the army. I like you, Cyrus. I respect your record in the war. But I'm going to do my job, and you're going to move aside, or we're going to move you. No, Cyrus said. The word hung in the cold mountain air. Behind Jessup, the other soldiers adjusted slightly in their saddles, ready. The tension was unmistakable. Don't make me do this, Jessup said. For the first time, there was something other than professional distance in his voice. Weariness, perhaps. The exhaustion of a man who'd spent 30 years implementing someone else's vision of order. I'm not making you do anything, Cyrus said. I'm making my own choice. You do the same. Jessup turned to Otto. Pack up his instruments. He's done surveying for the government of the Colorado Territory, effective immediately. The contract is canceled. Payment will cease as of today. He turned back to Cyrus. That's the cost of your principal. You've got until sundown to clear out. If we find you helping that warrior beyond then, there will be charges. I understand, Cyrus said. Otto didn't look at him. He simply began unbuckling the surveying equipment from Cyrus's pack, his movements efficient and final. The transit, the chains, the protractors, the instruments that had been Cyrus's livelihood for 3 years were removed piece by piece. When he was done, Otto mounted his horse and rode away without a word. The other soldiers turned to follow Jessup back down the valley trail, leaving only dust and the smell of horse sweat and the absolute clarity of consequences. By sundown, Cyrus had made his decision. He would move Neshoba deeper into the mountains, find him shelter, and get him to whatever camp of his people might be waiting in the high country. It would take days. It would cost him everything. His contract, his livelihood, his partnership with Otto, his standing with the territorial government. But some lines, once you've drawn them in your journal, demand that you stand on one side or the other. Cyrus had spent his life measuring distances. This distance, between what he could live with and what he could not, he would not measure. He would simply walk it. Neshoba could barely walk. The wound had swollen despite the salve, and fever had set in during the afternoon, the kind of fever that announces itself in shivering, and the particular way pain radiates outward from a single point. Cyrus had to support most of his weight, carrying him as much as walking beside him. It was not a comfortable arrangement for either of them. Cyrus's limp worsened under the additional burden, his left leg already protesting its journey into terrain that demanded more than it had been designed to provide. But Neshoba's wound was on his left shoulder, and so they found a rhythm. Cyrus on Neshoba's right side, Neshoba's right arm across Cyrus's shoulders, Cyrus's right arm around Neshoba's waist. They moved slowly through the aspens, following the ridge trails that Cyrus had been surveying only days before. The irony was not lost on either of them. A Union cartographer was helping a Chiricahua warrior escape using the very maps that Cyrus had drawn to guide them away from capture. They didn't talk much as they walked. The effort required by both of them was too intense for conversation. Neshoba's breath came shallow and careful, the breathing of a man managing pain. Cyrus counted their steps, a habit from surveying. 1, 2, 1, 2, the way you count to establish rhythm and distance. The canyon walls glowed copper in the fading light, stone formations that shifted color as the sun descended, from gold to amber to deep red. They passed through a meadow where elk watched them without moving, the animals' dark eyes following the slow passage of 2 wounded men through territory that did not belong to any of them. They crossed a stream so cold that the water burned Cyrus's boots, and he had to help Neshoba through it, both of them aware that hypothermia was now another threat to add to fever and infection. Neshoba began to talk as they walked, not in English but in Chiricahua, words that Cyrus did not understand, words for the landscape and the things around them, names for the tree, names for the water, names for the stone. It was not conversation. It was a kind of naming ceremony, a way of reclaiming territory through language. Cyrus would repeat the words back, his mouth unfamiliar with the shapes, his accent probably dreadful. Neshoba would correct him, speaking the word again with the patience of a man teaching a child. It was the closest thing to friendship either of them had known in months. A man who was losing everything, serving as a student, to a man who had already lost everything. The first night after they left the rock formation, they camped in a canyon with a small stream. Cyrus had perhaps $40 in his pack and some dried food from his supplies now stretched thin for 2. He changed Neshoba's bandages again, applied more salve, and sat watching the fire. His journal lay open on a rock beside him. He stared at the pages documenting his surveys, mile after mile of work, line after line of measurements, all the precision and effort of 3 years of his life, committed to paper, and now made worthless by a single moment of choice. He thought about opening the journal to the section he'd been avoiding for 2 years, the pages containing Eleanor's name written in the margin of the last map he'd made before she died. He hadn't turned that page since the funeral, but tonight, with Neshoba sleeping restlessly by the fire, fever still high despite treatment, Cyrus opened to those pages. There was her name, Eleanor Tanner, written in his own hand in the margin of a survey of the South Platte River Valley. He had written it there to remember that she was the reason he was surveying, the reason he was measuring, to give her a home to return to, territory they could call theirs. And then the consumption had come, and all the measuring in the world couldn't stop the waste of her body, couldn't prevent the day when she simply stopped breathing. He turned the page. The next page was blank. He took his pencil and wrote, October 23rd, 1878. Carrying a man who carries a world I never mapped. Lost everything to gain nothing but the possibility of principle. The stars at 9,000 feet in the Colorado Territory in autumn are more numerous than dark. They are so abundant that the darkness between them seems accidental. The Milky Way arched across the sky above the canyon walls like a river of cold fire, ancient light reaching Cyrus's eyes from stars that had already died before human civilization was born. At that altitude, in that darkness, with the world reduced to the small circle of firelight and the vast circle of stars, Cyrus understood something about surveying that he had never understood before. That all measurement is a kind of reaching towards something that cannot quite be grasped. He measured the distance between where he was and where he wanted to be. He measured the elevation of mountains. He measured the angle of rivers. But what Eleanor had understood, what Neshoba seemed to understand, was that there were other kinds of distances, distances that could not be measured with instruments. They could only be walked. "Why?" Neshoba asked. His fever had broken slightly, and he was lucid now. "Why help me? You stand against soldiers. You lose everything." Cyrus didn't answer for a long time. He stared into the fire. "I used to draw maps for the army," he finally said. "Maps of territory where they were going to kill people. I was very good at it. I was precise. I measured everything. And I never asked myself whether the precision mattered when what you were measuring was how to kill efficiently." He looked at Neshoba. "I came west to measure the land, not to participate in deciding who got to live on it. I'm not going to stop now." Neshoba said nothing, but something in his expression changed. Not gratitude, he would never be grateful, but perhaps something like recognition. The recognition that Cyrus had made his choice, and it had been an informed one. On the second day of their journey, they reached a canyon that Cyrus had not surveyed yet. It was late afternoon, and the light was turning amber gold that makes the high country seem to exist outside of time. He saw the tracks first, prints in the soft earth near the stream, fresh from that morning. Moccasin prints, too many for any wandering band, the prints of people who knew where they were going. He looked up and saw the smoke, a thin column rising from deep within the canyon, the kind of smoke that comes from a cooking fire rather than a signal fire. "Your people," he said to Neshoba. They moved slowly toward the smoke. As they got closer, Cyrus began to see other signs. Blazed trees with marks so subtle you would not notice them unless you were a surveyor. Marked rocks in patterns only a trained eye would recognize, the subtle markers of a well-established but hidden camp. The Chiricahua had been here for weeks, perhaps longer, had transformed a piece of wilderness into home without leaving the kind of obvious traces that an army surveyor would have recorded. Cyrus realized they had been watching him while he was surveying. They had allowed him to draw his maps, knowing that eventually he might come to understand what the land already knew. A single rider appeared on the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the pale sky, horse and rider perfectly still, like a formation that had always been part of the rock. The moment stretched. Then the horse moved, and the rock became a man. Then another rider appeared. Then 5 more. Warriors emerged from the tree line in ones and twos and groups, and others rode down from the high passes. And within minutes there were perhaps 20 warriors surrounding them in a loose semicircle. They were not threatening. They simply surrounded, the way a circle of hands might hold something precious. Neshoba spoke something in Apache, and the tension transformed into recognition rather than threat. An older man rode down from the canyon rim and dismounted with the deliberate grace of someone whose body still knows how to move even after decades of hardship. He was in his middle 50s, with lines deep in his face that spoke of decades spent in the open country. Lines like a map written in skin, recording every winter, every loss, every moment of difficult decision. His scar on his forearm, visible even from a distance, was the pale color of old injury. His name was Ahote, and he was the chief. not because he was the biggest or the strongest, but because the other warriors watched him and deferred to something in his bearing. He walked to Neshoba first and placed both hands on the younger man's face, a greeting between people who thought they might not see each other again. He held the gesture for a long moment, his dark eyes fierce with something that might have been relief or might have been rage at the waist. Then he turned to Cyrus and looked at him for a long time without speaking. In that silence was a kind of assessment, not hostile, but thorough. This was the man who had stood against soldiers. This was the man who had chosen principle over payment. The chief's eyes contained multitudes, skepticism and gratitude, and the particular wariness of a man who had learned that white men's choices usually contained hidden costs. Then Ahote's face shifted, the assessment completed. He looked at Neshoba again, and something passed between them. Information, family, the particular language of people who understand what sacrifice means, who understand the mathematics of survival. A younger warrior who spoke English with the careful precision of someone who had learned it from listening and practice, stepped forward. He was perhaps 30, with the bearing of someone who understood that translation is not simply language, but the impossible task of moving truth from one world into another. You are the surveyor. We have watched you. You drew lines on the land, and then you stood against those who give orders. Why? Cyrus thought of his wife, of the war, of all the ways he'd tried to stop running and failed. He thought of the maps he had drawn that had made the killing more efficient. He thought of the moment when he had chosen to stand still instead of walk away. Because the lines I draw don't matter more than the people who walk the land. And I have drawn enough lines that decided who lived and who died. I don't know how to undo that, but I know how to stop doing it. Ahote nodded slowly. He spoke again, and the translator said, "We will send scouts with you. They know the country to the north, passes that no white man has mapped. When you are safe, the scouts will bring you back here. Then, you will complete your maps with our knowledge guiding you. You will show the territory as it truly is." One of the warriors brought forward a wooden stake, about 2 feet long, carved from fresh-cut pine. Words were carefully carved in Spanish. La tierra recuerda a los que la caminan con las manos abiertas. The land remembers those who walk it with open hands. It was the most honest survey marker Cyrus had ever seen. When you complete your maps, Ahote said through the translator, you will mark them with this stake. So those who follow will know these paths were drawn by men who respected the earth and the people who walk it. Over the next 3 weeks, 2 Chiricahua scouts guided Cyrus through mountain passages so intricate and beautiful that they seemed to exist in a different world. The scouts, Chicago and Diyin, carried no instruments, no transit, no chain, no compass. They navigated by memory and intuition. Work that would have taken him 3 months took exactly 21 days. The acceleration was not because Cyrus worked faster, but because he was no longer working alone. The scouts showed him trails that switchbacked through hidden valleys, passes that wound through stone formations like arteries of a vast, patient creature. They moved through terrain that seemed impenetrable, finding passages that opened suddenly where no passage should exist, water sources appearing exactly where Chicago predicted. Cyrus began to understand that the scouts' knowledge was a different kind of precision. Not angles and distances, but intimate attention, the kind of knowing that comes from walking the same territory 1,000 times. Every evening, they would make camp in locations that seemed barely sheltered, and yet proved to be perfect. Spots where water was nearby, where stone formations provided wind protection. The scouts marked the trails as they went, but Cyrus realized many marks were already there, part of a system of subtle signage throughout the mountains. Some were blazes on old trees. Some were stacked stones. Some were carved notches in rock so minimal you would think them weathering. These signs created a map that only existed for those who knew how to read it. A map made of landscape itself rather than drawn on paper. Every evening, Cyrus recorded what he'd seen in his journal, but the recording felt secondary now. He was learning that his job was not to create knowledge, but to recognize knowledge that already existed. CTA number 1. Subscribe to Western Hearts and Honor so you never miss the next story. There are more like this one waiting. When the work was done, the scouts brought him back to the canyon where Neshoba was healing. The younger warrior was standing when Cyrus arrived, his shoulder bound but functional. He nodded once when he saw Cyrus, a gesture containing gratitude and the particular solidarity of two men who had chosen the same impossible thing. Chief Ahote was there, and he gripped Cyrus's arm in a way that transmitted understanding. You kept your word. You walked the path. Cyrus stayed in the canyon for 3 days, resting, being fed, understanding for the first time what it meant to be held by community. Cyrus carried those maps back to a new surveying job in New Mexico, and eventually to the territorial government office in Santa Fe. The road that was built from his surveying work became known as the Northern Pass Route, and it cut travel time through the mountains by nearly 2 weeks. The government never knew that a Chiricahua war chief had sponsored its creation, that every route was chosen not because it was the most direct, but because it was the most respectful of the land. The map Cyrus submitted included the carved wooden stake at key points along the route, marked with the phrase about walking the land with open hands, rendered in Spanish so the message was comprehensible to different peoples. No one asked him where the phrase came from. No one asked why his surveying work had suddenly improved so dramatically. He was a surveyor, and he had done his job. Years later, when the wars had mostly ended and the frontier had begun its transformation into something else, Cyrus stood at the trailhead of the Northern Pass Route. He was older now, his gray hair fully white, his limp more pronounced from decades of walking. The carved stake was still there, weathered by 30 years of sun and wind. But the words were still legible, still readable, still transmitting their message to anyone who stopped to examine them. Golden aspen leaves scattered around the base in the autumn breeze. The morning frost was melting on the stone, and the light was the particular warm gold of early fall. The same light that had shone on the day he found Neshoba bleeding on that rock formation. He touched the words with his weathered hand, his surveyor's hand that had held instruments and written measurements and drawn lines. And he thought about all the maps he'd drawn, but the best map he'd ever drawn was the one he couldn't write down. The map made of footprints and trust and the particular courage of a man who had chosen to stand still when everyone else walked away. That was the real cartography of honor, not the maps that bore government seals and were filed in territorial offices, but the maps that were drawn by choices, by the terrain that a man walked because he could not do otherwise. And the land, as always, remembered. The land remembered those who walked it with open hands. The land remembered Cyrus Tanner, the surveyor who had learned that the greatest distance was not one that could be measured with instruments, but one that could only be walked with principle.